how do we go about understanding why requests are slow? And we'll see that there's a lot of useful information in the request details. And sometimes I help people who end up not using it well, and I'm going to help you see what to focus on. And you can dig into other things too, but there's some key things to focus on. And in particular, many people are very interested in this, and sometimes they don't find it. So they're thrilled when they find that you can see for every request what JDBC processing there's been. Now, again, this is old hat for some of you, but I just do this with people every day where they go, oh my goodness, you can show me the queries that are running in my request. Every request, I can see every query, or the top slowest queries is the way it works. So yeah, we'll see that in a moment. And more important, and again, old school people have been using FusionReactor for a long time, they sometimes miss this. You can not only see what queries have run, but you could also see other things. FusionReactor tracks various other things. And so, for instance, in particular, you might see HTTP calls out of your application server. So in the case of CFML, we're talking about CF-HTTP, or its equivalent in CF script. Or in Java, we're talking about the HTTP client library. And under the covers, application server engines maybe call out to that HTTP client to some other server, and you can see that within a request. So sometimes when your request is slow, it's not because of queries, it's not because of CPU, it's not because of memory, it's not because of your application, it's because the thing you're calling is slow to respond. And with this feature to look at a request and say what were the calls out to other things, you might go, oh, that's it. That explains why this request was slow. We never fathomed that was happening. And not only can you look at that on a particular request, but then I'll wrap up by showing you that you can look at these things like queries and these kind of transactions across all requests, the history of them, the most recent 100 of them, the slowest of them that have happened, things like that. So we'll get to that at the end. It's really amazing. So you can not only drill in on a particular request and say, why is it slow, but you can maybe find out, oh, look at that. Every hour we have our HTTP calls out to another server slow, or every 5 minutes our queries pile up, and it's happening to lots of requests. And these are things that you could see if you knew where to look inside of FusionReactor. So, and then we'll wrap up telling what's coming up in the next part, which is where we can dive into some things when it's not these things. When it's not these things, why is a request slow? And then, as always, I try to end with resources for learning more, and we'll have time for questions and answers. And I may answer some during, so feel free to pipe up. I'm watching the questions if you have any. All right. So again, this is the second of a planned 4-part series. If you haven't seen it, the first part was focused on what just happened on my server. So using the parts of FusionReactor that lets you look at what's going on right now and very recently. And we covered several things in that, and I'll leave you to look at that. And then again, in the next one, we'll talk about what things could you look at that aren't these things I'm about to talk about. And then finally, in the last part, we'll talk about what do you look at when your application server has gone down and come back up, because a lot of what's in FusionReactor's interface does get wiped out on a restart. But the good news is that there are places both in the interface, if you're on a relatively modern version of FusionReactor 7.2 or above, but also there's logs and alerts and other things. So again, we'll talk about those in part 4. So the bottom line is, with all these, if you understand all these things, you can solve nearly every problem that comes up. It's just a matter of using the right tools to solve the problem. And that's, we've found over the years that some people get overwhelmed with FusionReactor's interface. So this is to focus on, how to look for specific things and get your problem solved. So we do presume you're already using it, although you don't have to necessarily be using it regularly. You're probably overwhelmed by it and don't know where to look to solve problems. And these apply to pretty much any Java or CFML server that FusionReactor can monitor. It's very rare that I'll point out something that's unique to any particular application server. And as always, these presentations are being recorded, so you can come back and watch this later. Let me just double check that, make 100% sure. Yes, it's being recorded. Okay. And just real quickly, so in part 1, we talked about be careful not to presume that you know what's going wrong. You really want to use the tool to find out what is going wrong. We talked about how you could look at what's going on currently in the web metrics page. Really amazing, got a lot more features than even I showed then, because we're trying to keep these short and sweet. So there was a whole webinar in the past on tips and tricks and some cool things you could do on the web metrics page. And then we talked about looking at current request processing and the request activity, and we talked about the fact that there was this history, and we'll dig a little bit more into that today. We talked about the request error history, which could be helpful in some cases. We talked also then, wrapping up, about how you could use FusionReactor to look at things like CPU and memory, but often that's not where your problem is. I know that some people think it is, but with this tool, you'll know what the problem is, and sometimes it's not CPU or memory. And we also showed that you could look at garbage collection, because people think it's that, and you can look at this and see, no, it's not that. So then, again, that leads to this one. Say, okay, well then what is it? What's making these requests slow? And so there's 15 different webinars we've done, and we ended the last session pointing to that. I won't do that again this time. So again, look at part 1, or just go to the webinars page. If you just Google FusionReactor webinars, you'll be taken to the page where you can see the 15 webinars where we go into these things in various detail. So if any of them grab your attention, go watch the past webinars. All right, so let's move on to why are your requests or transactions slow? And we're going to do demos of the things I just talked about. So we're going to just dive right in with demos, no more slides, and we'll talk about, well, not, no more, but no more until the end. So we're going to go into some demos. So as last time, I'll start out by showing my own site, carehart.org. There is also the available demo site. So if you want to try the stuff on your own machine, feel free, follow along. If you don't have FusionReactor currently installed, or you don't currently have access to it, or you've got it set up so that you can't get to it from where you are. Anyway, that's covered in another webinar, how to fix that. But anyway, there's a demo site you can go visit called demo.fusion-reactor.com. Demo.fusion-reactor.com. Anybody can go there and see this. And this demo site happens to be set up with a Java-oriented application. So if you're a CFML person, you might find the requests don't look like what you'd expect, but the concepts, again, are the same regardless of the application server. And, I'll recommend you don't get too lost in looking into that demo and digging into things. Try to follow along with what we're talking about, because there's things that are important that I find as I work with people every day, they miss, and we don't want you to miss that. That's why we're here today. All right. So as I look at this, I don't currently have any slow requests really to look at, but that's the beauty of FusionReactor's history thing. If I look at requests, I have a feeling that there's something going on with GoToWebinar that's messing with my, I turn on this pointer, the highlighter, to show you where my mouse is, but now as I click things, nothing's happening. So it has nothing to do with FusionReactor. I'm clicking on the address bar of my browser, and it's not working. One of them days. I'm going to momentarily turn off that feature to see if it somehow affects things. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know. I know people last time said they couldn't see my mouse, and so we tried to turn that feature on. But let me just ask, is there anybody who's not seeing where my mouse is right now? I'm putting it on the web metrics title of the page. Now I'm mousing over the requests button on the left so I can see the various menu items, and I move up and down. Is there anybody who cannot see that? So far, nobody's saying they cannot see it. How about one person say they can see it? Anybody? I just want to make sure. Okay, good. Excellent. So everybody who's responding is saying they can see it. So we're going to let go of that issue of the mouse thing and move on. I don't know why some people last week couldn't see it. I'll say this. I did move the presentation to a different monitor. Maybe it's a lower resolution monitor. That may have been the issue. You may not really see the difference in what you see on the screen, but maybe it just allows the mouse to be seen. So again, apologies for these housekeeping matters. So anyway, moving on. So I was saying that if you look at requests, and we looked briefly at these things last week, so many people know that there's a history that says, show me the last 100 requests. That's we're focused on requests right now. Down here is JDBC below the screen, but there's requests history. That's the last 100 most recent requests. Slow request is the last 100 requests that were slow. And that's different from longest request, which is the 100 longest ever since the CF instance came up. So in my case, I happened to restart this instance just a couple days ago for some updates. And so it was more recently updated one day and 11 hours ago. Often I've got it up for weeks on end. So anyway, if I look at this longest request, I'm looking since it came up. If I look at slow request, I'm looking at recently slow. So I'm going to do that. So I've chosen slow request. here's my 100 most recent slow request, and slow is anything slower than 8 seconds by default. And that's configurable in the requests settings. I'll leave you to look into that. You can make it say, I want to consider 3 seconds slow, and then anything slower than 3 seconds would appear on this page. And they're in order not of their duration, but in order of when they recently finished. So it's focused on what's happened recently. And you can see that I have only had several slow requests today. Then it's last night at 11 o'clock. I just want you to see this sort of stuff is here. So anyway, now we want to know, why is this request slow? So this is where the rubber meets the road. This thing says it took 16 seconds, and I've not looked at this before today. I'm just randomly picking these. So like, any of you could do this. I want you to notice you can click on the URL, or you can click that little tiny button. I like to click on the URL because it's easier. It won't run the page. And by the way, some of you won't see this word profiler. That's only in the Ultimate Edition or the trial if you're running that. So don't worry about that for now. We'll cover that in part 3. Next session, we'll talk about that briefly. If you don't have Ultimate, don't worry about it. We're going to cover other things too. So anyway, back to this. So if I want to know why was this request slow, the first thing I do is I click on the request to see the details. Here's the request details. It says transaction details because technically a request is a sort of transaction, but we know this is a request page, and there's the URL that I'm running. There's how long it had been running. Here's how many CPU milliseconds it had been running underneath that. And now here's where I always make sure everybody understands this. If you just scroll down this page a little bit, most of the answers to why the request is slow are going to be right here. If you look at total query, total time, that's the total time spent doing queries. There were 4 of them in this request. And this is both doing the queries, sending them to the database, having them run in the database, and come back. Whereas the total query execution time is the time spent in the database. So you can see there's a 1 millisecond difference here, but you might see a bigger difference. And the bigger the difference, the larger whatever you brought back probably is, because the bigger it is, the more time it takes. So if there's only 1 millisecond difference, it's likely you didn't bring back much. Anyway, the bigger point is, what's the total query total time? I can therefore say that out of the 16 seconds this ran, only 200 milliseconds was query time. So it wasn't queries. So there's no point digging into the queries. That's not my problem. And I just want to point that out because many people jump right to the JDBC tab, and I'll look at it and see there are queries there, but they're very fast. That's not what matters. If you've never seen it, this is how you see the queries that ran in a request. If you missed it, we're on the request details. We're looking at a particular request. And if I want to know what queries did run, I click on the JDBC tab. And it tells me how many ran and how long they took and how many rows they brought back. And that's all interesting, but I'm just looking in descending order, what's the slowest query? And I'm just telling you, I don't need to worry about this one because it's only 60 milliseconds. And it's summed to only 200 milliseconds. And so I'm saying that's not really where our problem is. So if it's not queries, the next question is, could it have been CPU time? And that's the next line. So there's thread CPU time, 2.8 seconds. And 2.8 plus 200 is 3. So I got an explanation for 3 seconds, but 3 seconds, that's not 16 seconds. So I'm missing 13 seconds, which I can't understand. Well, the next thing, this is really important, the next thing that you want to see is this relations tab. If you see it, then it says that FusionReactor tracked, and by the way, on older versions, you may not see it, but on more recent, last couple year versions of FusionReactor, you'd see relations. And in it, it breaks down at the top what kind of other transactions have there been. So again, the request is a transaction. We don't need to worry about that. JDBC queries, as it were, queries, updates, deletes, store procedure calls, whatever, ORM calls, anything. Those are tracked under JDBC request, and we already know there weren't many. This says when they happened relative to the life of the request. They happened at the beginning, how long they took. We know that's not the problem. What I'm saying is that, does it say something else? Does it say that there was an HTTP, for instance? And no, it doesn't. So I'm going to show later how to find one that does have a CF HTTP. Let's not do that yet. But I'm just telling you, if you'd had CF HTTP calls, CF mail, CF FTP, again, in more and more recent versions, FusionReactor is tracking more and more things, especially things that talk outside of the engine, as transactions. So you may find it there. So if you do, that'll tell you how many happened. There's the table here of what kinds happened and how long they took. So you may find the answer there. And then if you look down here, there's again a repeat of what are the transactions, how long did they take, and if there were other ones, you'd see them. So you may find the answer here, and we'll find one later that may be more representative of something like that. And I'll just say that right now, if you were in this same situation as I am, where you've got a request that's not query time, not CPU time, and there's no relations, if it's already finished, you'd be like, well, how am I supposed to know what it's spent its time doing? And that's what the profiler's for. I'm not going to show you that today. I'll show you that in part 3. But that's where, if you have the Ultimate Edition, this will tell us, well, where was the time spent in the request, down to the Java method, which is a little bit tricky, but I'll show you in the next session how to interpret that information. So anyway, we're not going to use that. So the point is, this particular request, I couldn't see readily what the cause of the slowness was, but let me just pick another one. I'm just going to back up and pick another one. I just use my mouse keyboard key to pick another one. So I'll pick just randomly this one. So it's 11 seconds old. Okay, and this is more typical of what you're going to see. So here's the total, 11.9 seconds, and there's the query time, 11.85 seconds. So these 17 queries took most of the time. So that's more typical of most of you would see. There was no CPU time. And so again, here, if I look at the JDBC tab, this is where it gets interesting. There were queries that took 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, 900 milliseconds, and so on. And again, this is not the presentation to get into why they're slow, why are they slow now when they weren't slow before. Those are all good questions. We did a whole webinar late last year on troubleshooting database processing. So you can go watch that webinar to get into this subject in more detail. Because usually this is not about your code, because this code may have run exactly fine 5 minutes ago. It's usually something on this database server, and it could be something going on that you're not expecting. And FusionReactor doesn't have any insight into your database server, but it at least points you to it and says you got to go look at your database server. Again, that's what the previous last year's webinar was highlighting, that you got to get monitoring tools on your database server. So anyway, let's move on. So that was cool. That was an example of one that did show that. Now, rather than look around for one that does HTTPs, I'm going to show you instead how, if we don't know there's one, how would we find them? So we've just done request details and JDBC processing within requests. We talked about other transactions. I haven't seen any. We'll come back to that in a moment. But what about the history of requests and history of, I meant to say transactions there, my apologies, transactions across recent, slow, and longest requests. So check this out. This would be where if you said, I think we have a problem, and I'd like to know if that problem is happening to lots of requests, as opposed to I'm looking at a particular request and saying, why was that request slow? So first of all, over here on the left, there's transactions. So there's requests, transactions. And it's also got activity and history and error history and all these other cool things. And let's just say we look at history, because this screen confuses people and misleads them, and they don't realize the value of it. So I'm looking at the history of the 100 most recent, quote, transactions. Well, unfortunately, it starts out looking like it's just URLs, and I go, well, that's like the request page. And many of you may have dismissed this page thinking it wasn't interesting. Oh, it's very interesting. Look up here at the top. It says root transactions, and it said here root transactions, but you didn't notice that, right? So if you look at root transactions, wow, look at that. So this is telling me that FusionReactor has been monitoring on my Cold Fusion server. It could be your Java server, Tomcat, WebSphere, JBoss, Lucy, anything, doesn't matter. Whatever sort of transactions FusionReactor does monitor, it breaks those down and says, well, hey, I don't want to just see root transactions. I want to focus on slow CF HTTPs, which again are HTTP clients in Java. So here's my various calls to CF HTTP. And that's interesting. So I use a CAPTCHA, Google reCAPTCHA, and when my site presents things to people to fill in forms, they have to fill in the CAPTCHA. So here I see calls out of my code to Google to verify their CAPTCHA or to get the information that's going to be used. Anyway, the point is, this is the 100 most recent CF HTTPs, and I can see they go back to yesterday and eventually the day before. And none of them are particularly slow. I mean, there was one at the bottom that was 4 seconds, and I might be curious to see that, and it's a call to the Cold Fusion updates. And I'll just say that was transaction 1, which means this is when my CF instance restarted, and the first thing it does is call out to that. And as you guys know, when you restart your application server, often things are slow. And you might say, well, this is a call out to their server. You're right, but it could be that it was just generally slowed by processing on my server. Even the processing of that outbound call and its response could have been slowed because I just restarted my application server. Or it could be that it was slow, and that's another subject for another day. And you could take that up with whoever you're talking to. But here's where I'm saying, let's not look at the 100 most recent. Let's look at the slow ones. So if I go to transactions, slow transactions, right? That's not history, that's slow transactions. Unfortunately, it goes back to looking at root transactions. If I change it to say, show me CF HTTP calls, well, I haven't had any slow. And you may say, well, wait a second, we just saw that one that was 4 seconds. Well, this page also uses that 8-second indicator for how long to regard a transaction as slow. So unfortunately, it would only show you one slower than 8 seconds. And you may say, well, how would I change that? I will go to transactions settings. So again, we're talking about transactions, settings. Actually, no, I remember I discovered this recently. It was kind of confusing. It is under request settings. Even though we're talking about transactions, it's under request settings. And if we look at web request history, slow threshold, let me just change that. I'll change it to 4. I don't think it's going to take effect and show me ones. It may show me ones that were more than 4 seconds in the past, but it may also be that it will only start tracking them from this point forward. But let's just see what happens if I go to transactions, slow. Well, actually, let's start with looking at request, slow request. That'll be a way to prove that it is focused on, or it has changed the time. So in my slow request page, do I now see any that were slower than 4 seconds? It looks to me like it did, and I'll tell you why. I'm just paging down through my results. I noticed the ones that say 9 and 8 seconds, they're not in little text. Usually when it was just above it, it's in little text, I've noticed. But these are all in the big text. So I think it did change it, so that's good. I don't have any that were between 4 and 8 seconds for it to show me, but I'm pretty sure it did it. So now the real question is, did it change the slow transactions? And remember, I've got to change it to HTTP. Has it? I don't. Slow transactions. Sorry, I feel like I didn't do what I meant to do. Slow request. Sorry, transactions. Slow transactions. Okay, transactions, slower transactions. CF HTTP. So it still isn't affecting it, but I just noticed on that screen right before me. Okay, no, that was. But see, that is now that smaller text I was talking about. So when it regards request time, it is saying if it's slower than 4 seconds, make it appear here. But I think it may also be, no, it's looking at history. So again, I apologize at the moment. I don't want to get stuck on focusing on that. If any of you need to solve that and you don't solve it on your own, at the end, I give you an address for the support folks, and you can ask them that question. I brought it up recently to them because I got confused by this myself. How do you change the transaction duration so that the slow transactions, it is showing that, so it just feels to me like it did make a difference, but we're not seeing it. We know we have one that was 4 seconds and it's not there. So anyway, I want to move on. I don't want to get bogged down in this. The bigger point is, so look at all the cool things you could watch. So if you didn't know it, let's say you do CF mail processing, and again, that's a CFML thing. If they take a long time, they would be rendered here. Now, it's very rare that mail takes a long time because the way CF mail works is it puts it in a queue on the file system in a spool, basically, sorry, a spool, and it processes them that way. So usually your CF mails are not slow. But anyway, the bigger point is that any of you on your own, when you look at slow transactions, you may find some significant things. Now, I don't want to focus on web requests or JDBC requests because those are covered in their respective pages, but I'd focus on HTTPs or HTTP clients or CF mails or anything else that's outside, calling out. And let's just see if on the demo server, does it have anything interesting? So I'll look at transactions, slow transactions, and we'll see what kind of transactions that it has. And again, if it wasn't responding, might be my network. So now this is interesting. In this application, I'll point this out. I don't really cover this typically. There's also ways you can define transactions in your code with FusionReactor API calls, FR-API, Frappy, FR-API. So if you want to Google that, just Google FR-API, FusionReactor, and you'll find the docs on using that. And you'll see that one of the things you can do is in your code, you can declare what you regard to be a transaction, and that's what this code did. And so there's a cart transaction, and this would be showing what cart transactions were slow. Again, none were slow. And then because it's in Java, it also tracks Hibernate and Spring and struts. Those are all built-in features. I'm pretty sure that you don't need to do anything to configure them. So anyway, back to bigger picture stuff. So we can look at transactions. We can look at slow transactions. I didn't say this before. I'm going to go back to my own server. If we look at transactions, longest transactions, again, those would be the 100 longest of whatever type I pick since my instance came up. And there's our 4-second one and these 200 millisecond ones. So sometimes you might want to look at things from that perspective, what have been the slowest things. But just beware, sometimes it's slow because it's among the first things that happened. So don't over stress on what you may see as the first one. But look for patterns, look for frequency of slowness, look for the time frames in which they ran. You can sort this as well if you wanted to. You can sort everything here by the different columns. And then for what it's worth, some of you may benefit from this. If I'm picking, for instance, a CF HTTP, I can also break it down by what kind of request method was it? Was it a GET? Was it a POST? Was it a HEAD? Was it a STAT? Whatever. If they're done, they would be broken down. If they're in the list, then they're of that type. And if they're not in the list, then it means there's none of that type that are in the list. And again, it is only the 100 most recent, so be careful. You won't see very far back in the history. All right. I'm looking to see any questions or comments. Okay, none so far. All right, now moving on. I'll just point out, you could clear the history if you wanted to. That would lose it from this display and only track then things from that point forward. That could be valuable if everything is early on and it's filled up the screen with lots of stuff from the first hours of this application restarting. You might want to clear it out and say, I just want to focus on what's going on from this point forward. Pretty much all the pages have that button to clear that history. Again, we covered that in the Hidden Gems talk a year and a half ago. So again, look at the webinar to learn more about that. I want to move on in this transactions to some things that might also be helpful for you. So there is this external resources link down here, transactions, external resources. That's on relatively recent versions, and I think it might only be in Enterprise, FusionReactor Enterprise and above. So if you don't see it, you know, that's why it's not there. But if you do have it, and if you're on a recent version with the right version, if you do have it, it first comes up maybe not showing anything for you, but that's because it's picked a particular thing to look at. And you might want to change it to say, I want to look at something else. So remember we saw a bunch of calls to Google. Well, also it's only looking in the last hour by default. And it has only choices of a minute, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, and an hour. Or look, I can say since start. So now this is going to show a graph and also below that text about the calls that have been made. And you might remember we saw a bunch of calls to the RE CAPTCHA. There have been 30 of them. So look at that, 30 calls to the RE CAPTCHA site, taking an average of 76 milliseconds. The duration and the average duration, beware about that difference. So this would be the total, and this would be the average. So they've been fast on average. And then it tracks, you know, CPU they took and memory they took. Those aren't always going to necessarily be as helpful as it might seem. But the bigger point is, check it out. You can see which ones you have called and of what type and how long they took and what's the URL. So that's external sources. And then these graphs are interesting. I'll leave you to dig into them to see. If you just mouse over them, you can see what they're all about. Okay, and then let me just see if, yeah, we'll see there was just that one call in my case to the Adobe ColdFusion updates when I restarted. And then if I were to log into the administrator, I'd see another one, but again, we're not going to get into that detail. All right, so these are things about why things are slow. We're trying to focus on why things are slow. And let me show an interesting way that might be helpful for some of you to tie things back to a request. So let's say I looked at, just even to go back to transactions, slow transactions, because I think this is the way, well, we don't have them. So we'll look at transactions history, just take my word for it. We'll go to transaction history and we'll look at HTTP calls. And again, we saw these. Well, let's say you said to yourself, well, that's interesting. I'd like to know what request is it that did this. Now, this may be getting a little bit confusing for some to follow along, but this is a call out of a CF request, in my case, CFML, a call out of it to another server. this is not my server, that's the server I called. What if I wanted to know what request made this call? Okay, what request did this? So if I click on this, it doesn't show me here. Again, that's the URL that was called, and I don't see anything here about what was the page that did it. Well, that's in the relations. It is the relationship between this call that was made and who made it. If I click on relations and scroll down, I'll see that the master transaction here is the URL. And there you guys, you may remember I said it was when somebody's doing a comment on my website. So in my prepare comment page, that's the page that actually calls out to Google to do the RE CAPTCHA. So I can get back to that. If I click on this, I'm now looking at, well, and in fact, that particular request, let me explain that. So if it were still available, I'll go to relations. And if I clicked on it, this is telling me this is the request that did do that CF HTTP. It was only 1 second in time. When I click on it, it would have to be one of the 100 most recent requests for it to still be in FusionReactor's history. It only keeps track of the 100 most recent requests. Now, if it had been slow, and this is important, again, I may be losing some of you, but some of you I know are hearing me. If this had taken 8 seconds or more, or actually now I've changed it to 4, if it took 4 seconds or more, then it would be kept in the slow requests. It'll keep 100 slow requests. So I just want to say, sometimes when you're trying to track this down, you will find something slow and say, oh, I'd like to see what call did. And when you click on this, it will be there because it'll be in the slow requests. And you could look at that request and maybe you'll see, oh, look at that, it did other calls. So again, in this case, I can't look at it because it wasn't slow. Let me see if we can do that on the demo server instead. So I'll pick transactions, slow transactions. I'll pick some particularly slow thing. I don't know if we'll catch anything slow in here. I'll just use this as an example. So it's a JDBC request. I could go about this through the JDBC tab. But let's say I wanted to say, whoa, what was the request that did this? So it's a transaction. That's what matters. I'm looking at the transaction details. And if I go to relations, it tells me what was the request that made that transaction. And there it is. And it is slow. Therefore, there's a really good chance it's still going to be in the history. So when I click on this, it's taking me to, in a moment, there you go, it's taking me to that page about that URL that was run, that took 8 seconds. And we can see, yes, it did a query. We were looking at a transaction that was a query, therefore we can see that, yes, the query took a long time. Yes, we can see in its relations that it did a query that took a long time. So anyway, that's how you follow the thread back from a transaction to its master. That could be helpful for some of you to be able to do that. Before I leave, let me just point out also that if I'm back up at the top, you may not notice this, and I hope someday it'll be changed, but the JDBC stuff, it's down here. There's a button that says JDBC. And here again, you can see what's running, what has run, what's been longest, what's been slowest, and it just focuses on queries. So this is older than the transaction support. The transaction support's been added to cover lots of things, but originally it was only queries, and it had its own page dedicated. And so it's just the same sort of information. So if I look at slow transactions, I'm focused on what have been the 100 most recent queries that were slow. So let me again level set for folks that maybe got a little bit lost there with the transaction stuff. Let's say your focus is queries, and you're saying, I'd like to focus on what queries have been slow. That's what you'd want to do. You'd want to go to JDBC, slow transactions. And this is the, across all requests, this is the 100 most recent queries that were slow. So it doesn't matter what request they were in. This is not looking at the queries within a request. There's value to that. This is looking at queries across all requests. And so we can see it's just a list of them. And as we saw before, I could drill into them. And if I wanted to say, well, what request was that associated with, I'd go to relations and find the master transaction, and it was 27 seconds. So there's a really good chance it's still going to be in the history. And if I clicked on it, I would look at it. Now, we've already done that, so I want to move on. I want to show you something else that might be interesting, because some of you work in environments where you have lots of applications, and you may say, well, this is all interesting, but you know, I'm looking for my stuff. I don't care about somebody else's. Actually, back up. If you're looking at FusionReactor, you're usually an administrator person. So maybe it's not my stuff or somebody else's, but I'm focused on one application's problems, not every application's problems. And this, by default, does show all queries across all applications. And what FusionReactor deems to be an application is identified over here, and it picks it up basically from however it can. So in CFML, it uses the application name. In other ways, it picks other things. And then again, you can use the API to declare what the application name should be. Or if it were a transaction, it would show you the transaction. And otherwise, it's picking it up from the name. But anyway, what I'm saying is, let's say you were looking at this and said, no, I've got application X that's saying to me their applications are slow. Can I find evidence of slow queries for application X? A lot of people miss this. It's up here. Look, all apps. So look at that. I can see any app that's run on my application. And again, this is the ones that have run. It's just picking it up by looking at what FusionReactor has tracked. There's no list you predefine. It's not looking at everything on the server. It's just saying whatever's been run, FusionReactor has tracked these requests across these applications. So if I said I want to focus on, I'm just going to pick one randomly. They didn't have any slow requests. I'll just pick another one randomly. And that one did have slow requests. So that's a different one. And I happen to be using this third-party tool called FuseGuard. Some of you recognize that. And it ran a query, and that query was slow. Now, in my case, I'm using the local Derby database in ColdFusion, so I'm not too concerned that that's terribly slow. It's only a couple times slow. I won't dig into that. But anyway, there you go. So I could see what have been the 100 most recent requests, or sorry, among the 100 most recent queries that were slow, were there any for this particular application? And I found there were. I saw a question come up. Is there a way to see the entire query? It seems to be cut off if the query text is long. Excellent point. So first of all, the person asking that question is either referring to this, so there's how long is this before it gets cut off, or if I, let me go to the relations and see if I, yeah, should be able to catch that request. Let's say you were looking at a request and looking at the JDBC tab, and here you remember you can see the queries that happened on that request. And in either of these cases, that may be cut off, and you might want to see 500 characters or something like that. Well, there's a setting for that under JDBC settings, JDBC settings. Text limiting for the log and the display. And I think I've raised mine to 1,000, so I'm not sure what your default will be. But anyway, there it was. So if you missed it again, it was JDBC settings. And I believe it was, yeah, it was the very first page of the JDBC settings and the bottom of the page. And there you go. We said thank you. Cool. So again, that affects that. Now, just one other thing, as long as we're talking about this, we'll cover this in part 4, but I want to say it now in case I don't remember it then. If I'm setting up alerts to send me an email when there's a problem from FusionReactor's perspective, those alerts also limit how long the query will be, and those are separately controllable. So under protection settings, email settings. So protection settings, email settings, there's a maximum SQL length in the email notifications, and that's a different number, and you could separately control that. Okay, all right. So that's covered all the things that I wanted you to see. And one thing I just want to point out in conclusion is beware also that sometimes what you're going to be looking for instance, may be slowness that's not tied to a particular request. And one of the benefits of using that last approach I did of showing you the transaction history and transaction slow requests, you might see some query or even some HTTP call, which it turns out is not tied to any request at all. And I just want to be clear about this. FusionReactor is watching any calls out of your application server to a database server, to a third-party server, however they're done. And what I'm saying is that most of us think, well, it's only going to be done by my code or the code running on my server. It's doing a CF query, it's doing a CF stored proc, it's doing a JDBC Java call or a HTTP client call or a CF HTTP. Yes, those are 99% of the reasons you'd be calling out to a third-party server. But sometimes your application server itself may do calls. So I'll just say, for the sake of ColdFusion people, for instance, if you have the client variable database, client variable set to be stored in a database, there's a process that runs by default every hour and 7 minutes that calls out to that database and says, hey, are there any records in the client variable database I should be purging? And that purge doesn't run because of a request you ran. It just runs randomly, by default hour and 7 minute intervals. And you might see in your history slow queries to that database, and they're not going to be tied to a request. So what I'm saying is, don't just focus on slow requests. It is worth looking at the transactions from the perspective of, just are there slownesses perhaps due to that? And you might be surprised one day to look in there. I don't think that that's the case for me. They'd have to be slow for them to show up, but let's just look really quickly. So I'm going to look at transaction, we'll just say history, just to see if we might luck out. Well, we are talking about queries, so I'll just look at query. I'm trying to use my keyboard instead of the mouse. Got JDBC. We'll try slow transactions. And I'm just going to look among the 100 most recent slow queries. Were any to C global? No. C data? No. But if I did have queries to the C global or C data, they might show up in here as updates or delete. It would be a delete, and it would say delete from C global, and it would have a big where clause. And that would not be tied to a particular request. It was running on the basis of CFML, the engine, and Lucy, I believe, does it too if you store it in a database. So I'm just saying, be aware. You might see things in here that are not tied to a particular request, and that could be just as interesting. Also, for those doing CFML, if you do CF thread, there's a tag introduced in CF7, and it's in Lucy as well, CF thread, to identify a chunk of code that is within the application right there within the CF thread. You can look at it and see that's going to run, but it doesn't run in the context of that request. The whole purpose of the CF thread is it says, no, don't run it in me, go run it on your own. And it literally creates another thread in the JVM called a CF thread thread. It's not too important to dig into that now. But the point is, that is not running under the context of your request, and it's not tied to your request. There's no way to connect the threads that are running on behalf of a request. Those threads run separately. And it unfortunately happens that FusionReactor currently doesn't have any insight into CF thread threads. You can't say, show me what CF threads are running. Show me the history of CF threads. I wish it would, but it doesn't currently do that. My point is, if you have a long-running HTTP or a long-running CF query, and it's running in a CF thread, it could show up in the list of the slow transactions or the slow queries. But again, you'd say, oh, that's not tied to a particular request. I just want you to know it will be there. So at least it will be there if you look into that. So if you see slowness in queries and you don't see slow requests, look at the JDBC slow transactions and you'll see, oh, look, there's been these queries that have run, and you might recognize, and it'll tell you, I'll just show you really quickly, like right here, I'm looking at, slow queries. There is a thread ID right here. And every request, typically in modern versions of ColdFusion and on Lucy, they run typically under an AJP thread between your web server and ColdFusion or Lucy. And in most people's modern applications, if it's Tomcat based, it would be using this AJP thread as well. The point is, when a CF request runs, I might have lost some of you, just back up. If a CF request runs, it typically runs on a thread that is an AJP thread. And this query is also running in the context of a request that's running on that thread. So remember, if I looked at this query, looked at the master transaction, we'd see that it was running on the same thread. The point is, everything you do in a request typically happens in a given thread, and it runs till completion. But if you do a CF thread tag, then the stuff inside of there gets shunted off to a different thread. And what I'm saying is that someday you may be looking at this list and find that there's references to CF thread. It'll literally say CF thread, some number. So that's the JVM saying I ran that thing as a thread on a thread whose ID was CF thread something. And you will see it in this list, but you won't be able to go any further than seeing that. You won't be able to see what request kicked off that CF thread, that sort of thing. It's not tracked that way. One other thing before I leave this screen, I see this happen to a lot of people. They see this link and they think, oh, that's interesting. Let me click on that. Let me tell you Don't. It's not worth it. If I'm looking at the history of past requests, and this is saying that this query, or let me just not lose some of you with talking about queries, just look at my history of requests. So I'm looking at the history of the 100 most recent requests that have run. And it too shows the thread. And I've asked the engineers to think about taking this link off because there's really, to me, no value. This is saying this request did run on that thread. That's of minor interest. It did run on that thread. But this link says, hey, and what's that thread doing right now? Well, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the history of this request that ran, finished. It doesn't matter what's going on that thread right now. That thread's being used by some other request. But if you click on it, it does what's called a stack trace, which again, we'll talk about in part 3. But there's no point to looking at a stack trace of a thread that was used by a request that's finished, because that thread either may be doing nothing, which is the case right here, or it may have moved on to be running another request. But the point is it has nothing to do with the request you're looking at. If you're looking at the history of a request or a transaction, don't click that link. There's no value to you to look. But you can look at it, and all I'm saying is that if you saw that it said a CF thread, then that means that transaction ran in that CF thread. I don't see anybody asking any questions or comments, so I'll leave that at that point and we'll move on. And we're about done. So those are some of the key things that I want you to be aware of to help with troubleshooting. There's so much more, but these should help get you started in conjunction, especially with part 1. And then we'll go on into other things in part 2 and 3. So again, this was to talk about what sort of things might clearly explain why requests are slow, why transactions are slow. Hopefully we've accomplished that. Part 3, we're going to cover the less obvious things. So I've given a hint to a couple of them already. Profiles, stack traces, and some other cool things. So let's just take a quick look. So part 3, we'll talk about stack tracing, profiling, and then this newer feature that's in the Ultimate Edition, in the newer versions of Ultimate, called the CPU sampler and the memory profiler. So again, if you don't have Ultimate, you won't be able to use those. But the first half of the presentation, well, actually, and profiling is in Ultimate as well. But the stack tracing will be valuable. So if you guys are thinking, I'm not on Ultimate, you'll still come, because you'll want to see the stack tracing. There might be things you'll pick up that maybe you didn't understand. And then it'll benefit you to see what Ultimate can do, because sometimes the stack trace and all the other information I've shown you will not answer the question of why a request was slow. The profiling might help you. And then there's unique situations where sometimes it's not about any request that's running. It's some background thread. And it may not be a CF thread. It may be some other wacky thread that's running in the JVM. And the CPU sampler can really nail that. You know, and this has been very helpful to show people, hey, look, the reason why everything's slow on your server, it wasn't any request that was running. It was this background thread doing PDF document creation that had kicked off hours ago because of some request that died, but the thread's still running. I mean, you never know what you'll find when you look at things from that perspective. So my point is, we'll talk about how these trickier challenges, there are features in FusionReactor that could maybe help you dive in and find the problem. And then finally, there's that memory profiler. And we've talked about that before in a whole session, but we'll talk about it briefly in part 3. And then part 4, a couple weeks after that, we'll talk about post-crash troubleshooting and the things that you can leverage from that. And you'll see the description about that and more on the website. So we saw, again, how we could see what's going on now with regard to all these sort of things that are common problems. We saw today how we can typically understand slowness in requests, whether it's in the request, in the query, if there's any queries running, and then these concepts of relations and these other sort of transactions that FusionReactor might track. And then across all requests and across all transactions. So one way or another, you should be able to slice and dice to get to the bottom of your problems. And we'll dig into things more deeply to understand other reasons of slowness in part 3. So if you have further questions, first of all, just be aware that we've got the website Fusion, and I say we, I don't work for the company, but I'm a big fan, I support them, and I do these webinars, so we, in that sense, there's the website fusion-reactor.com, and down there you can get, of course, downloads, docs, and there's substantial docs. Many people miss them. There's videos, tech notes, forums, and much more. And I said this earlier, but I'll repeat it. If you have questions, don't suffer, ask them. Send them to sales if they're oriented to buying FusionReactor or licensing issues, that sort of thing. And then if it's about understanding how to use FusionReactor, understanding how to interpret a problem, send it to support. there's a degree to which they may say you're getting into solving your problem, and for that you need to look into consulting. And if you notice, there's a link there for consulting. So cfconsultant.com is a sister site to fusion-reactor.com, and it's to get help that's more of the consulting nature to solve a particular problem, not a feature of FusionReactor that's not working or showing you how to use it, but solving your problem. That's consulting. So check that out. And you can call the number for sales-oriented questions. And we do welcome your feedback on this webinar or the others and any you'd like to see.